At 5:40 on a gray morning in late 1944, a line of captured German soldiers stood behind barbed wire near the Channel coast, waiting to be processed for shipment west. They were hungry, cold, and absolutely certain about one thing. America was a brittle, decadent place held together by advertising, jazz, and lies. They had been told this for years by newspapers, radio bulletins, officers, party lecturers, school books, posters. The enemy, they were taught, was rich but weak, clever but corrupt, technologically noisy and spiritually empty. It would collapse when pressed hard enough. Then a U.S. guard walked along the fence and handed one of them a bottle. Dark glass, script label, metal cap. Coca-Cola, and somewhere in that line, a prisoner laughed and muttered, "Propaganda." Not because he had never seen the logo, quite the opposite. He had seen it in Germany before the war, on signs in shop windows and in restaurant coolers. But now, here in captivity, with transport ships waiting and defeat creeping closer, this felt staged, too convenient, too theatrical, too American. Unlimited cola for prisoners? Impossible. Therefore, psychological trick. That moment, small as it was, opens a window into one of the strangest collisions of the Second World War. Ideology versus abundance, doctrine versus logistics, and the way a soft drink became evidence, first of manipulation, then of reality. By the time war spread across Europe, Coca-Cola was already global. On the eve of conflict, it was bottled in dozens of countries, including states that would soon be at war with one another. That alone is worth pausing on. Before the tanks, before the bombers, before total mobilization hardened borders, one commercial system had already threaded itself through them. In Germany, the company's local operations had grown through the 1930s under the energetic leadership of Max Keith. But war does not care about corporate maps. Once Germany and the United States were enemies, Coca-Cola syrup from America could no longer flow into the Reich. Trade barriers and blockade severed the pipeline. Keith and his team improvised a substitute drink from whatever ingredients they could obtain under wartime scarcity. They called it Fanta. That detail matters because it flips the myth. The German soldier who saw Coke in an American camp and thought fake was not reacting to some mysterious alien beverage. He came from a world where cola had once been normal, then disappeared into embargo and replacement. The familiar brand had become politically and materially impossible in his daily life. So when it reappeared in vast, effortless quantity on the other side of the Atlantic war machine, it looked less like ordinary commerce and more like a deliberate signal. Look what we can do. And to be fair, it was a signal, just not always in the way he assumed. Now zoom out to America's war economy. When the United States entered the war, corporate promises and military logistics fused in peculiar ways. Coca-Cola leadership declared that any serviceman should be able to buy a Coke for 5 cents wherever he was deployed. The slogan-like clarity of that idea turned into engineering. Mobile bottling units, plants near fronts, supply chains that moved sugar, bottles, crowns, and machinery through combat zones. By war's end, billions of servings had reached uniformed personnel. This was not humanitarian neutrality. It was patriotism, branding, morale, and industrial planning, all at once. To Americans, the bottle became emotional shorthand for home, small, cold, sweet, familiar. To many Europeans, it became shorthand for the American method: standardize, mass-produce, distribute at absurd scale, repeat. To captured Germans, that same system could look like theater, because theater is exactly how totalitarian states train people to interpret public life. In a propaganda state, every poster hides policy, every radio bulletin has an agenda, every display is arranged. The prisoner brought that mental framework with him behind the wire, so when he encountered what looked like theatrical abundance, he gave it the label he knew: staged. The irony is that he was partly right. Not in the cheap sense. No, the cola was real, the calories were real, the sugar was real, the refrigeration, trucks, bottle depots, and supply officers were all very real. But yes, there was message in it. Abundance in wartime is never mute. The American government and military understood image, so did private companies. They understood that morale is strategic, and that strategy includes symbols people can taste. A hot meal, a cigarette, a chocolate bar, a cup of coffee, a bottle of soda. None of these are trivial in war. They are morale converted into matter. And then, those symbols crossed the barbed wire boundary. German POWs in the United States eventually numbered in the hundreds of thousands, housed across hundreds of camps. Under the Geneva framework, U.S. policy generally aimed to provide conditions that were regulated, predictable, and comparatively humane by the standards of the war: food, shelter, medical care, and work details under specific rules. This did not mean comfort, it did not mean freedom, it did not erase fear, boredom, factional violence among prisoners, and the humiliating fact of defeat. But many POWs encountered a daily material reality that clashed sharply with what they had been told about the enemy. Functioning kitchens, steady rations, canteens, work programs, and a host economy whose farms and factories seemed to run on inexhaustible throughput. And yes, sometimes Coca-Cola. Not in every camp, not at every moment, not as a magical river of soda pouring from taps. Wartime systems were uneven, but the symbolic encounter happened often enough to become part of memory. That black, fizzy, unmistakably American drink appearing where ideology said it shouldn't. Imagine one prisoner. We can call him Carl, not because this is one documented individual, but because history often arrives as a pattern before it arrives as a name. Carl is 22, raised in Württemberg, apprenticed in metalwork before conscription. He remembers pre-war signs for American products in city streets, remembers hearing dance bands on forbidden frequencies, remembers adults saying one thing in public and another in kitchens. By 1944, he has spent years in uniform and months watching the Wehrmacht retreat. Captured in France, shipped across the Atlantic, he reaches a camp in the American South. The heat is wrong. The light is wrong. The birds sound wrong. The English is a machine gun of vowels he cannot decode. On day 3, a canteen queue forms. Cigarettes, soap, maybe razor blades or sweets depending on stock. Then bottles appear in a crate, brown glass sweating in the heat. He stares, suspicious. Someone jokes, "Careful, it's probably medicine." Another says, "No, this is that American stuff. My uncle had it in '38. A third insists, "Exactly, so this is for photographs. They want us to tell stories later." Carl takes one anyway. The cap snaps. The hiss is sharp. He drinks. It tastes like memory before ideology finished hardening. Not because the beverage is profound, because it is ordinary. And ordinary in war can be revolutionary. This is the key historical mechanism. Totalizing propaganda survives on distance. It needs the enemy to remain abstract, a silhouette, a caricature, a monster, or a clown. POW life, by contrast, forces contact with routine. You do not meet a caricature when an American corporal argues about baseball and then shares a wrench. You do not meet a caricature when a farm foreman complains about weather the same way your father did. You do not meet a caricature when the camp medic treats your infected hand and mutters that paperwork is worse than surgery. And you do not meet a caricature when the canteen clerk shrugs and says, "Out of this brand, take that one." The prisoner may still hate the enemy. He may still believe in victory for months after it is impossible. He may still fear returning home dishonored. But abstractions begin to fray under repetitive, banal evidence. A bottle here, a full mess line there, coffee again tomorrow, ice cream in July, fresh bread after work detail, replacement boots arriving on schedule, a warehouse that never seems empty. To someone formed by late war scarcity, this is not just comfort, it is epistemological shock. Now add a second irony. While German POWs in American custody were processing this experience, Allied POWs in parts of Europe were enduring worsening shortages as the Reich's logistics deteriorated. Accounts from camps in Germany describe meager rations and heavy dependence on Red Cross parcels. When those parcels were interrupted near the end, conditions could become desperate. In other words, two captivity worlds existed simultaneously, one where scarcity tightened like a noose, and one where captivity remained captivity, but inside an economy still capable of overproduction. The contrast did not make America morally pure. It did not erase racism, segregation, violence, or political hypocrisy in the United States. But for many prisoners, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Material systems were speaking louder than doctrine. Back to the phrase, unlimited Coca-Cola. Historically, unlimited is the language of astonishment, not accounting. It means more than expected, more than believable, more than a prisoner from a rationed economy thought any enemy would waste on captives. It means abundance felt theatrical because the scale itself was hard to process. And there is a broader strategic lesson here. People often explain wartime persuasion through posters and speeches, but the most durable propaganda is infrastructural. It is bridges rebuilt faster than expected, supply trucks arriving on time, hospitals with clean sheets, rail junctions functioning after bombardment, factories switching output in weeks, civilian stores still stocked despite mobilization. In that sense, Coca-Cola was never just a drink. It was a portable demonstration of a system's depth. Sugar refining, glass making, rail freight, trucking, refrigeration chemistry, retail discipline, and military permission, all condensed into one cold bottle in a POW's hand. No leaflet could compete with that. Of course, not every prisoner was convinced. Some interpreted all kindness as manipulation. Some remained committed Nazis. Some enforced ideological conformity within camps through intimidation or violence. Some simply focused on survival, not rethinking. History is not a conversion montage. But many post-war testimonies across this broader experience, German POWs working in American agriculture, living in regional camps, interacting with civilians under guard, point to gradual cognitive dissonance. The enemy was not what they had been sold, not always benevolent, not always fair, but not the collapsing caricature either. For some, that dissonance became political reevaluation. For others, it became silence, a private revision never spoken aloud at home. For many, it became memory anchored to sensory fragments: coffee, tobacco, white bread, canned fruit, a jukebox, a bottle. And then the war ended and memory did what memory does. It simplified. In retellings, whole structures collapsed into one emblematic moment: a guard, a crate, a hiss of carbonation, a prisoner squinting at a label and thinking, "No way this is real." That compression is not false, it is narrative physics. Human beings store systems inside symbols. The Roman road becomes empire. The ration book becomes home front. The train timetable becomes modernity. The Coke bottle becomes America. Which brings us to the deeper documentary truth. The scene is not really about soda. It is about credibility. Totalitarian messaging had told millions that liberal capitalism was decadent and fragile, but on battlefields and in prison compounds, they encountered an opponent that could fight a global industrial war and still flood its own institutions with standardized comforts. That did not prove virtue. It proved capacity. And capacity wins wars as often as ideology does. If you stand in that imagined campyard long enough, you can almost map the 20th century through objects in men's hands. A Wehrmacht field-gray tunic stitched in a continent running out of fuel, an American clipboard printed in a bureaucracy scaling faster than any in history, a Red Cross parcel label, evidence of transnational relief amid total war, a glass bottle of Coke branded in cursive, capped in steel, chilled by machinery. One worldview says history is destiny, race, myth, and will. The other says history is tonnage, calories, chemistry, and distribution networks. In practice, both sides used myth. Both sides used symbols, but only one could keep the bottle cold at scale. There is one final layer to this story, and it is uncomfortable. When we say POWs saw abundance and reconsidered propaganda, we risk telling a flattering fable that consumer plenty naturally produces truth. It doesn't. Abundance can deceive, too. It can distract, sanitize, and conceal injustice behind bright labels. The post-war world would prove this repeatedly. Yet, in the specific context of late World War II captivity, material abundance had evidentiary force because it contradicted a precise claim that America was structurally weak and near collapse. On that question, the canteen shelf offered a blunt answer. The bottle was not an argument. It was a data point. Then another, until disbelief became harder to maintain than revision. So picture the prisoner again, the one in line near dawn, convinced the drink is staged. He twists the cap, drinks, waits for the trick. No trick arrives. Only sweetness, carbonation, and the unnerving realization that the enemy can afford to make ordinary things feel inexhaustible. Years later, maybe he tells his grandchildren about battles, marches, surrender, ships, and camps. Maybe he keeps politics vague. Maybe he skips guilt and fear and shame because those are harder to narrate over dinner. But eventually he reaches the strange part, the part that still sounds unbelievable. He says, "We thought it was propaganda. We thought no country could have that much. And then we kept seeing it everywhere." That is how empires are recognized by their prisoners. Not only by guns, guards, and flags, but by the mundane surplus of a civilization that can wage total war and still hand you a cold drink. And in that tiny, fizzy interval between suspicion and acceptance, a piece of the 20th century turns on its hinge.